So now we'll move on to Aysel Madra from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Sweden, and she'll be presenting a framework for building human rights cities in Turkey. Now, okay. Switch. Do you want to plug in, or you want to? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. So how do we get? Okay, it's fine. Okay, perfect. Hi. So my name is Aysel Madra. I work for the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. And for those of you who don't know Raoul Wallenberg Institute, we are a institute based in Sweden, even though I actually live in Turkey, which I will explain briefly. We are a Sweden-based institute that works on human rights issues and humanitarian law. So even though it's an independent research institute, it is actually part of Lund University. And we have a bunch of offices around the globe, and we have an office in Turkey, in Istanbul specifically. And one of the projects that we are currently working on in Turkey is a project called Human Rights Cities in Turkey. And so what I'm going to try to do here today is briefly explain you what the project is about, and also try to instill in as many instances as I can the academic background and the academic framework of the project. So we've been talking about human rights cities for a day now, and we've come in the panel discussions that I actually participated in. People actually came up with certain definitions of human rights cities. City are a community where universal human rights principles are applied in local settings. So I think, and of course the basic definitions, the basic principles of human rights cities, equality, non-discrimination, participation, etc. Were uttered. So I think this definition of human rights cities is important, but what we need to keep in mind is that human rights cities differ, right? So they differ in their size. There are big human rights cities, there are smaller human rights cities. They also differ in terms of their mandates, right? Some certain human rights cities, they focus on specific issues, others focus on specific groups, others take a holistic approach. And also the relationship of these cities vis-a-vis their governments also differ, right? Some cities are in more centralized nation states, whereas the others have more purview. So the point I think here is that it is important to think about human rights cities not only as a definition, but also as a framework that could be applied in different settings. So why are human rights cities important? And again, just to sort of briefly summarize and refresh our memories, it allows us to localize human rights in local settings, right? So cities, and this has been uttered many times, have a more direct link to understanding the needs of their residents, which leads to more target-specific policies, and target-specific and better policies, and also to better participatory practices, right? In which people are included in decision-making processes, which is an example of which most people would identify as good governance. So along with this comes this notion of inclusiveness and inclusive societies, which of course is a buzzword in these days, but it's also important, right? So human rights cities in this sense promotes global urban justice. It promotes inclusive societies, leads to inclusive societies, and helps establish this tradition or this culture of human rights as something that needs to be held on. And also one thing that we also need to mention is that it enhances actions that promote democracy in order to achieve sustainable development. So a couple of years ago, the UN said SDGs Agenda 2030, and our workload tripled, right? So SDGs are about, they're about everything, so leave no one behind. All these goals, they're very ambitious, and they can stay very abstract. But human rights cities, the framework of human rights cities, actually helps make these goals more concrete. So a couple of days ago in Turkey, for instance, we organized a conference on human rights cities, and this was one of the discussions, whether human rights, the discourses and norms of human rights are part of Agenda 2013, or whether, it's the agenda is merely about development. So my opinion is that human rights are very much embedded in these sustainable development goals. And the idea, I think the important thing that we need to keep in mind is that development, humanitarian development, economic, societal, whatnot development, and human rights go hand in hand. So for instance, in Turkey, when we talk to some government officials and whatnot, the attitude is that first we need to have economic prosperity, right? So we need to make sure that we're advanced economically, and then we can start talking about human rights. Then we can start talking about implementing human rights. But that's not how, in my opinion, it should go. It should go hand in hand, right? So you can't just have economic prosperity in the meantime sort of leave, don't care about people's rights and their well-being. And then once you reach a certain level of prosperity, of well-being, start talking about human rights. That's not how it works. And so human rights cities in this, I think, context is a very important tool, is a very important framework to bridge human rights norms and SDGs and Agenda 2013, which is very overwhelming at the local level. But also on the practical side too. So in Turkey, I don't know if you have been following the political developments, but many people sort of think about Turkey, the civil society, the public sphere in Turkey as a shrinking space, right? And to a certain extent, it is correct. So when you actually talk about SDGs with local authorities and government, it's actually a much more productive debate. So when you talk about human rights, for instance, because it's such a politicized issue in the Turkish context, for instance, you can feel a certain resistance. Well, when you frame human rights cities within Agenda 2030, within this development sort of framework, the response of the other side, of the authorities, are much more cooperative. And again, related to this is, of course, when we talk about human rights cities, we absolutely have to talk about working with local governments. And there are some upsides of working with local governments. So as I said, so I will not go over these in too much detail, but it is only at the level of cities, at the local level, that we can actually talk about participatory governance, right? So again, this notion that cities are able to sort of tailor their policies and procedures according to the needs of their constituents is something that enables human rights defenders or people in general to actually promote this notion. So here I just want to make a parenthesis and talk about because the project is about Turkey, I just want to briefly give a background about local authorities in Turkey. So as you know, Turkey is a big country, almost 80 million people live there. And there are different types of municipalities, but as you will see, in Turkey, approximately 93% of the population live within municipal boundaries. And there are more than 1,000, specifically more than 1,300,000 municipalities in Turkey. But again, one of the things I think that leads to this variety of human rights cities is the relationship of these local governments or municipalities with the national government. So Turkey is a very centralized government, right? So in this sense, it does have an impact on what we can do in cooperation with local governments or municipalities, but it doesn't mean that there's no room for maneuver, right? There's still things that we can do, but the dynamics of establishing human rights cities is going to be different in a context like Turkey. compared to, let's say, the United States, in which the structure of the nation state is already federal, which gives much more purview to municipalities and local governments, but also which has a very strong, vibrant civil society tradition, which also is not the case for Turkey. So again, I would like to think of Turkey as a case study for implementing or for trying to establish human rights cities or bringing in the human rights cities perspective. But just because Turkey doesn't have a vibrant civil society or is a very centralized nation state does not. I rather not model it as an inferior version of what the West can offer in terms of human rights cities approach. So there's still, I think, lessons to be learned from the Turkish case, but I think it's more productive to sort of not think of it as a linear sort of progression. So just a couple of words about our Human Rights Cities project in Turkey. It's a 3-year project, and hopefully it will not end in 3 years, but we will be able to secure funding for the upcoming years as well. So this is an idea that was actually born out of Lund and Raoul Wallenberg's Institute sort of ambition to be a lead in human rights cities research. And as the Turkey office, we decided to adopt this perspective, and we thought it would be useful for Turkey. And again, we thought about the local context, the national context of Turkey, right? After the coup of 15, for instance, or coup of July 15th, it became harder and harder to work with the central government, but still local governance and municipalities are much more easier to have access to. So that was also a decision, practical decision at the back of our minds. And when we first off started the project by forming a partnership with the Union of Turkish Municipalities in Turkey, so that we would actually have access to certain municipalities with whom we could work with. And considering the size of the office and other considerations, we decided to work with 7 pilot municipalities. And we selected them according to certain criteria. So political balance was important, right? So we didn't only want to work with municipalities that represented the government party AKP, but we also wanted to work with CHP, which is the pro-secularist party, and also the nationalist party MHP. So one political party that we are not in partnership, unfortunately, is the pro-Kurdish party, but we're hoping to sort of include a representative municipality that is under the purview of that as well. So we also thought about geographical balance. We also talk about, again, this is something that came up in the panel discussion yesterday. The agency actually does matter, right, at this level. So the existence of a mayor who's willing to make a difference actually can go a long way. So we also thought about the political will and commitment of the municipality as well, in addition to their technical capacity, their previous project example, and whatnot. So just to give you an idea, these are the 7 municipalities that we work with, and as you can see, we need, I think, for it to be more representative, we would really like to have a municipality that is on the eastern side of Turkey. So as I said, we have 7 municipalities, pilot municipalities that we're working with, 2 in Ankara, 2 in Istanbul, and these are all not intermediate cities, but big cities. Gaziantep, which has a very intense Syrian refugee population, and Antalya and Mersin, which are on the Mediterranean coast. And these, we held a workshop with the representatives of these municipalities, and we formed an academic advisory committee, and 2 of its members are here actually, Gülay and Yelda. If you could maybe wave your hands. They also did presentations, which is great to have them, because any questions that I cannot answer, I can just delegate to them. And so we brought all these people together, and we held a workshop with the municipalities, because we wanted the municipalities to actually come up with their ideas of areas that they wanted help in, all right? So we didn't want to impose anything. They chose, 5 priority areas: children, women, people with disabilities, elderly people, and migrants. So not all of the municipalities wanted to work with these groups, but we nevertheless, wanted them to make the decision. So again, this I think sort of goes into what I said at the very beginning. The establishment or the evolution of human rights cities can take different varying modes even in a single nation setting. So the project has 3 components: research, direct engagement, and forum building. So I'm more involved with the research side of the project. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to promote academic research on human rights cities in Turkey. We're trying to establish an academic network that brings scholars who are either working on human rights cities, which is not that many, but we're trying to sort of recruit scholars who could potentially be interested in this notion. So not only lawyers or law faculty members, but also city planners, architects, sociologists, and whatnot. And we're also trying to engage Turkish academia within international and regional networks. So we're here. So it's proof that we're actually doing this. We also have an element of direct engagement in which we're trying to strengthen the institutional and organizational capacity of pilot municipalities. So we're trying to integrate human rights perspective into the strategic plans of municipalities. And we also have a forum building leg, which again tries to bring these different actors together for the sake of participatory governance. So what I'm going to present on next is going to be at the intersection of research and direct engagement. And what we're trying to do, one of the very concrete things, although not the only thing that this project is doing, is trying to come up with a list of indicators for Turkey. And there were actually a very vibrant panel discussion on indicators yesterday. So human rights indicators are important, right? And there are 2 ways to go about it. Traditionally, these indicators used to be on, the focus used to be on violations of human rights, right? So it would actually look at international and national treaties and determine the case studies in which human rights were violated in. But what we wanted to focus was on, again, trying to bridge this notion of human rights and SDGs to sort of bring, to focus more on the development side. So we wanted to use these indicators to sort of evaluate progress, right? And human rights indicators are important in the sense not only to assess, to what extent human rights are, whether a country, whether a city is good or bad, but they're also important for creating a common language of human rights. There are tools for analysis, there are tools for analysis for comparison, and they are also means of data collecting, which I think is also important for the Turkey context, because as a researcher, one of the things that we actually have trouble is accessing decent, good, reliable knowledge, right? So this, we hope, is going to be an avenue for collecting data over time and across different settings in Turkey. So the idea is how to translate these abstract human rights norms mentioned in these national and international treaties into practical, concrete daily life practices in urban settings. And as I said, mentioned before, we focused on 5 disadvantaged groups. And the reason why we picked these groups is that, first of all, these are the groups that are, most commonly mentioned in international treaties and national treaties, but also the Article 10 of the Turkish Constitution actually mentions these groups, saying that special provisions for these groups, except for refugees, does not undermine the provision of equality. And there's a special law for refugees in Turkey. So that was our sort of legal footing. What we also tried to do is we decided to sort of analyze or investigate the relationship of these groups with the urban space in terms of their capabilities. Right. So for those of you who are familiar with the capabilities approach, was most articulated by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, and it's sort of a way to think about people's well-being in a sort of holistic way, right? So it's a normative framework for assessing individual well-being. I don't want to go into too many details because I had promised 20 minutes and I'm already at minute 19. But one way to think of capability is to think of it as a set of valuable functionings which they define as states of being and doing. So capabilities, in other words, are the tools that people can have to lead the kind of lives that they want to lead. So in other words, for instance, being healthy, right? Being healthy is important, but what a state or a municipality can do is only come up with the conditions that will ensure, that will allow a person to be healthy, right? So for instance, make sure that the water is clean, make sure that the air is not polluted and whatnot. So that's all municipalities and governments can do for people's, healthy. And then people, as a result of the existence of those functionings, can be healthy unless, there are other factors involved. So the question is, so what the way that we try to frame is, what services do or should the municipalities in Turkey provide for these disadvantaged groups in order to increase their capability set, right? So in order to make sure that these people can live a decent, good life. And again, we had to be realistic because, as I said, the capabilities, the purview of the municipalities, the local governments in Turkey is not that much. So we wanted to strategically sort of limit this capability list to three things. So one is accessibility, right? Of course, whether these people actually have access to the services provided by the municipalities. Participation, ensuring that, there is participatory governance, especially for the most vulnerable groups, and also safety. Again, here, when we were choosing these capabilities, we wanted to be realistic and not too ambitious. So what we did, and this is again a work in progress, we came up with two lists of indicators. One, human rights cities indicators for all, and then we came up with another list specifically for these disadvantaged groups. So just again, another parenthesis, one of the sort of pitfalls or the dangers or the challenges of focusing on these on disadvantaged groups is that it sort of gives way to this notion that human rights cities are only about giving advantages or like ameliorating the living conditions of these disadvantaged groups. But that's not the case, right? So when we're talking about human rights cities, we should be talking about everyone, even the socioeconomically, better off people, right? So if I'm coming from a, relatively more advantaged groups, still we live in the same, we breathe in the same air. So human rights cities are not specifically for disadvantaged groups, but for everyone who lives in that city. So that's why we came up with a list of indicators that would sort of cover everyone who lives within the area of the municipalities, but also indicators for different set of groups. And we sort of try to categorize them in terms of accessibility, participation, and safety and security. So this is not an exhaustive list. I just picked some of them just to give you an idea. And they combine both quantitative and qualitative data. So for instance, some of the things we ask is, the number of activities that the municipality organizes, the number of households which have access to clean water and electricity. Or we also try to incorporate, as I said, more qualitative, sort of open-ended things as well. So we asked them to list, the top 5 requests for services that they actually provide for men and women separately. And the idea behind it is that we're trying to sort of push the municipalities to actually collect data on these sets which they can use to sort of turn into policies and whatnot. And some of these are actually yes or no questions as well. So again, for instance, for specific groups, we have, we're asking for ratios, whether breastfeeding rooms exist or not, but we're also asking, for instance, again, for them to list the 5 top requests regarding children. So in a way, what these indicators can do is limited, obviously, right? So for instance, the question we ask whether a separate call line for children in need exists or not, right? So this is a yes or no question. So it mostly sort of targets the accessibility side in that sense. So it doesn't tell us much about the quality, right? So there could be a separate call line for children or for women, or there could be safety houses and whatnot, but we don't know about the quality of these houses, right? So in that sense, this is one of the things that we have not yet integrated into our indicators. So what we're trying to do is basically, again, I want to emphasize that these indicators are not going to solve like all of Turkey's human rights problems at the local level, but I think it is a start. And I think this provides us a way to work with governments as well, with municipalities as well. So the way that it sort of functions in Turkey, the elections are function in Turkey is that, for instance, in 6 months, there are going to be local elections. So what we're trying to do is we are trying to, in 6 months, at least have a draft of these indicators, right? And we're working very closely with a local NGO that works with with municipalities. So what we do is that our academic committee, they come up, there's actually a lot of work which I did not have time to get into, but they take this list with the NGO that I just mentioned, and they go to representatives of the pilot municipalities that we work with. And then we debate on it, right? So we ask them, so is this the kind of data you can actually collect? Because sometimes the municipalities, they do not have the resources to actually sort of collect the data that we actually want them to, or they are legally not allowed to collect the data that we ask them to, because of national policies and whatnot. So we ask, which of these indicators do you think would be useful for you? Do you think will help you sort of formulate policies within this human rights cities framework? And then we sort of negotiate with them, right? And at the end, we're still in this process, right? So we had sort of sit-down sessions with the municipalities, and we're going to have a bunch of others as well. And so the idea is, as I mentioned, in 6 months there are going to be local elections, and prior to the local elections, we want to finalize this set of indicators, which would be something tangible in our hands, and then we want them to think about. We want the municipalities, the pilot municipalities, to actually think about these indicators when they're establishing their action plans for the next 4 or 5 years. When we want them to think about these indicators, when they're sort of writing down their progress reports and whatnot. So in a way, this exercise of creating indicators is also a way we're using it as a way to sort of increase awareness about human rights cities in general. So again, the indicators are a specific thing that this project is doing, but I just want to mention very, very briefly some of the other things that we do. For instance, we do training of trainers on human rights issues or gender mainstreaming and whatnot. One thing also I want to mention, we organize conferences, workshops and stuff like that as well. But one thing, for instance, there were council decisions from 5 of the pilot municipalities to become a human rights city. So what does that mean? It's not legally binding. It doesn't mean much actually in legal concrete terms, but it does show a commitment, right? It does show that, there is some sort of a need, and that there's some sort of a conversation that is actually sort of evolving and hopefully potentially could lead to the establishment or the emergence of human rights cities in Turkey. So thank you very much.